Hello, Internet. Welcome to Politically Non-Binary. I'm Jackie Fox, and today I want to talk about conservatism again. The last time I did this, I talked about fiscal conservatism, but in this episode, I want to talk more about social conservatism because I find this form of conservatism to be much more interesting and dynamic. In part, this is a response to a meme that I've heard that you'll get more conservative as you grow older. And the more I think about it, the more accurate I think that meme is. But the reason that people don't think that this meme is accurate is that we don't have a very good understanding of what conservative actually means. And that's probably because we've had the Conservative Party gaslighting us about these facts for a very long time. It's particularly weird to me that they call themselves conservatives when they just aren't. In my last video, I talked about fiscal conservatism and how they're actually fiscally pretty liberal. A pretty good example of this from presidential policy would be looking at George W. Bush. George W. Bush not only started a war that would negatively impact presidential budgets for decades to come, that we ended up calling the Forever War because of how long its financial impact and also physical impact on the world was. But also, at the same time, he started his first term with massive tax cuts for the rich and doubled down with more policies to favor the wealthy. So I want you to imagine that you just got a notice at work that you're getting a 20% pay cut. And then you get home and there's a note on your door that says your rent is doubling. Would you say that this puts you and your general budget in a better situation or a worse one? Because I think anyone reasonable would say, yeah, my budget's doing really poorly right now. That's not good. Or, for instance, let's say you're making the same amount of money at work, and then you find out that your rent's going up, and then you decide to buy a new flat screen TV. Is that a conservative fiscal decision? Is it smart to face increasing costs when your money is actually limited, either because you aren't making as much or because more of it's going to expenses? These aren't conservative decisions. A more fiscal conservative policy could be found through Bernie Sanders. Looking at the Medicare for All Act, this pays for itself. In fact, some estimates say that this would actually save the government money. And in addition to that, if you look at Bernie's fuller platform for both 2016 and 2020, we can see that not only does it pay for itself, but in many cases by raising taxes on the wealthy and closing corporate tax loopholes, it generates a lot more income for the United States even than it takes away, while still expanding the social safety net and accomplishing more socially liberal goals. And this is one of the reasons why people talk out against the political compass or the Overton window. Because you can have someone like Bernie Sanders who can represent both maybe regressive ideology in some ways, although I can't think of a good example for him. You can also look at him as representing, say, liberal social philosophy or even progressive social philosophy, to be more specific. But you could also look at him as being fiscally conservative. And if you want to get more nuanced on any of those things, saying that he's fiscally conservative is just kind of looking at his politics in broad strokes. There are definitely places where he is more liberal and more conservative. And those two kind of balance out to a certain amount of moderation that I would call, maybe it's more fair on the fiscal sense to call him more of a moderate, but since we really don't have any conservative representation on either parties in the American political system of fiscal conservatism, at least on the national level, because as I noted, a certain level of fiscal conservatism or moderation is kind of required in state and local politics because they don't have the same, budgetary mechanisms to pay themselves and to just print money like the federal government does. In today's episode, I want to look more at the social axis, though. And this is going to be a bit of an oversimplification because I want it to be understandable in a video. Obviously, this is, like what I was just describing, a more nuanced topic that can't easily be reduced in this way. But also the symbolism that I'm using to represent it is a little bit in that I think that the social spectrum makes sense on a timeline. I think they could be really well indicated in modern politics using a timeline. The thing about using a timeline, though, is that there's this fallacy of historical progress. When typically historical progress is often 2 steps forward and 1 step back. It's never just a straight line into the future. It's only us looking at it from hundreds of years later and summarizing entire centuries or decades in a few sentences that we seem to think of it as having just this simple march forward to progress as if it were inevitable. It is not inevitable. Progress takes political action, and progress can be reversed by political action as well. And we've seen examples of that. Like, we would have thought that women's rights would have steadily increased since they were given the right to vote in the late 1800s or early 20th century. I forget exactly when that happened, but that was something that was pushed for by, at that time, a very socially progressive Republican Party. But that seems like the last social goal that the Republican Party ever had. And they kind of planted themselves in that era of politics in terms of their social goals. So as time has gone on, it has left their social goals more and more in the past. At a time, for a time, they would have naturally taken a conservative social position because the things that they had just fought for, the things that they aspired to, women's right to vote and the abolition of slavery were achieved. And there were people fighting to reverse those things. And for social conservatism specifically, it requires 2 things, both pride in something that exists, likely a political institution or way of life, and secondly, a fear that that institution will be compromised, is in trouble, is in danger. This is why fear is such an important motivator for the right. But it's also why the fear is a really important motivator now for the modern left, in a way that conservatives don't seem to understand. Because fear hasn't been that big a part of our politics, not in the way that it was on the right. And I feel like there's a lot of things that they just fail to understand on a basic level because they don't understand how fear affects the democratic position. So in my previous video, I mentioned that fiscally speaking, the Republican Party is liberal on their economic policy because ultimately they end up running very high budgets. They end up running up the bill. They are not fiscally conservative in that way. But they're also not conservative because largely, instead of defending institutions that they have pride in, they would seek to tear down modern institutions and regress to a previous point in history in which they felt more socially comfortable. This is a regressive inclination. It is not conservatism. You can't conserve something that no longer exists. Now, of course, this is nuanced. There are existing institutions, much of capitalism, much of the way that it has been rigged for big business. Republican politicians especially seem to appreciate this and want to conserve it against people like Lena Khan, Joe Biden, or Kamala Harris. But there's also a number of socially conservative positions that affect the Democratic side. In fact, I would say that culture, as well as our political institutions in the United States, have, through the later portion of my lifetime, slowly become better aligned, at least with the Democratic Party. Some people say that this is the world becoming woke, and you can label it whatever you want. The world is experiencing social progress, and that means that as this is followed by political progress, as we fight for, say, the institution of marriage being expanded to anyone, not just to straight people or straight white people. These expansions are things that people of color who would like to get married to anyone they choose, or homosexuals or trans people that would like to get married to whomever they choose, really have a lot of pride in and a lot of interested motivation to defend. Furthermore, any woman who would appreciate, easy and legal access to abortions has felt conservative over abortion law in the country. However, I mean, you can still feel conservative about it on a state level, but since it doesn't exist at the federal level, it is now maybe more of a progressive or even regressive philosophy to reinstate that on the federal level, depending on which way you look at it. But for gay marriage, something that currently exists on the federal level, it is socially conservative to defend that institution. Gay rights is conservative now. Good luck dealing with that, Conservative Party. In realizing that this all could easily be mapped to a timeline, I set up metrics and defined a few terms. We'll be discussing 7 different positions on the social timeline today. The midpoint of these, though, is conservatism. This is like the absolute neutral point. You live in the now, you want the now, and an absolute conservative would want to essentially conserve everything. The good, the bad, all of it. They believe that life is ideal in the current moment, that all of human history is built up to this, we're doing the best we ever have, there's no way to get better, or even that maybe improvement should be slow and well thought out. The pace of progress should be creeping. This is the conservative position, and this is largely pretty well aligned with the Democratic Party in general. However, there is still a bit of factionalism on the left, though this actually ends up being on the right when you look at it on a timeline. The whole left-right axis gets flipped. Moving a little bit forward into the future, having hope for the future, having hope that you can effect positive change and make the world a better place by changing current institutions or making them better. This is largely a liberal position, and we could break down standard liberalism into 2 camps. Incrementalist, which is a far more conservative way of thinking about it. In fact, I basically defined it as I was talking about conservatism. You know, the idea that everything is pretty good, we can improve some things, but we need to do it slowly and methodically. That's incrementalism. And then you have progressivism, which is like, okay, there's a lot of things that need to change. We need to get on this. We've waited too long, and there are a lot of institutions that need to be changed, rehabilitated, or improved, if not added entirely. That is the progressive social philosophy, that we move forward into the future. How can you tell the difference between incrementalism and progressivism? Well, my personal opinion on how to define these 2 things would be to say that incrementalists are looking for like the next couple steps. They're looking for change that might reasonably be achieved by the next presidential term. Maybe at the worst, maybe the next 10 years, all of your incrementalist goals could be achieved. This form of liberalism is the easiest to fade into conservatism, because when you think about where your goals are, if your goals don't evolve as you move through life, if you largely remain nostalgic for the same time period or desire the same changes and forward thinkings, right? Then you're slowly going to be sliding from progressive to conservative and perhaps even into regressivism as the timeline and progress potentially moves forward. Again, it doesn't move forward evenly, so maybe this doesn't happen as quickly as I'm stating, or maybe it happens even faster. For the progressive, the goals are more complicated. Progressives definitely have immediate goals, things that they would like to see done by the next president. But usually I would say progressives are far enough thinking that their goals don't end with the next president. The next president is merely a stepping stone to broaden what is acceptable and forward thinking, to move the country forward into the president after that, into the one after that. They're thinking 20, 30 years ahead and kind of imagining a more ideal future that can still be achieved within their lifetime. likely. I mean, we all like to think that whatever change we advocate for could be achieved within our lifetime, but, you know, these guys are thinking maybe 20, 30, 40 years out. But then you get into the more far left. And I don't want to say that it's impossible for these things to happen within our lifetime, but the long road into a stable socialist or anarchist state, for instance, from here is a very long one. There are a lot of changes that need to be made, and one of the biggest changes is cultural. We have to become culturally acclimated to that, and the next generation of our culture must push that even further until we achieve kind of a fully utopian state. It is not something that we can reliably imagine will happen within our generation, or even within the next one. This is a political project that our grandchildren will have to pick up and continue. It is a political project that their grandchildren will likely pick up and continue. This is probably the only position that doesn't see time creep move it to conservatism, since it's already so forward-thinking. If anything, by the end of your life, you're just like a progressive or an incrementalist. You've achieved most of your ideals and goals, and there's only a few left that you really want to see, and everything else you leave up to the younger generation of idealistic progressives. But then let's look at the other side, right? So there's two types of regressives, much like there were two types of liberals. And these are kind of defined in the same way. So there are regressives out there that would like to return to like pre-gay marriage, pre-trans acceptance, you know, just move the clock back to like Ronald Reagan. You know, can we just do Ronald Reagan again? Something that's maybe within like the, oh god, that's like 40 years. That's actually a little far. But I guess the point here is that many of these people were conservatives at some point. This is probably why the Republican Party identifies as conservatives, because there's a lot of people who nostalgically think of themselves as conservatives within the Republican Party. But they've actually fallen so out of step with what exists, they become dissatisfied with the current culture. They no longer have pride in it. Instead, they just have fear. The pride is gone. The fear is all that remains. And they want to return to a political position that they have, even someone relatively young can be a little old school. Maybe you just want things to be like they were when you were a child. Then we have traditionalists. Traditionalists are pushing further back. Still, something that is possible that it existed during their lifetime, though there are young traditionalists who are fighting for things that only existed within their father's lifetime. For instance, there's a lot of young bigots that are pushing to end all the advancements of the civil rights era in the 1960s. So essentially they're trying to go like 60 years back in time, but these people are like 20, 30 years old, you know? Even their father may not have been alive in the pre-civil rights era. And this is more the position of a traditionalist. Like, someone in my family has described this time to me in an idealized way. I have imagined it in my head in a further idealized way. And I want to return to this point in the past, which, because of those two layers of idealization, doesn't really exist. But also, we don't really like going backwards, necessarily. So you have to fight pretty hard. The pride that once conserved has now succumbed to the fear. The fear wants to break everything new, because that's the only way that they can imagine returning to the past. In some ways, that's kind of a correct assessment. Things happen not just because of single factors, but because many different areas of our lives progress at once. So these are more like deconstructionists. Instead of conservatives, think of them as demolitionists. They want to take a sledgehammer to the whole system to break it down to something that they may not even understand. But if you really want to take this idea to its logical extreme, and there aren't a ton of people who do this, but like there's a lot of positions that this final position on the regressive side could indicate. But essentially it's people going 100, 200, 500 years into the past. People who want like a theologically run state, like Catholic Rome in the past, or people who want a strongman emperor. You know, there's a lot of fascist or dictatorial inclinations that lump into this group. They just want a strong leader instead of democracy. Like often this group of people wants to revert back to pre-democratic eras. Like they're so regressive that even the idea of democracy is antithetical to their belief system. That's why I labeled them neo-feudalists and neo-monarchists.
You gotta get out and vote. In 4 years, you don't have to vote again. We'll have it fixed so good you're not gonna have to vote.
Because essentially they want warlords or kings or something. They want some strong man to tell them what to do. Now, with all of that out of the way, I return to say that conservatism is essentially the position of, generally speaking, more than any other overriding political instinct, and people can be complex. Certain issues they can be progressive on, certain issues they can be regressive on, certain issues they can be conservative on, depending on their personal preferences. People and their political positions are unique. But if you consider yourself overwhelmingly to be a conservative, if you are aligning your politics with reality instead of existing in a sort of phantasmic fantasy world where the word conservative means what you want it to mean, then ultimately that means that far more than any other political inclination, you want to conserve the status quo as it exists. In a way, it's the most politically neutral of all standpoints. It's what we're doing is already okay, no changes to the course, stay the course is essentially the idea of conservatism. And when you look at it like that, and you look at how the parties represent themselves, there are some progressive ideas, but ultimately the people who are talking about defending currently existing institutions, expanding them, enriching them, or actually funding them are the Democratic Party, whereas the Republican Party, the so-called conservatives, instead of conserving the status quo or social institutions as they exist, although they do have a few issues that currently exist that they tend to cherry pick and not want changes to, but general social changes have kind of left them behind. And because of this, they are no longer conservative of many institutions. And in fact, if you're looking at people talking about defunding anything more than, say, just the police, they want to defund basically every other political institution, a lot of which the Democrats feel conservative of. This is where that misunderstanding of fear comes in, and misunderstanding and thinking of the Democrats as being mainly politically, socially liberal, which they are in some ways, but also they're pretty conservative, and there's a big conservative normie Democrat base that kind of likes the status quo. They like presidents like Biden, and they like presidents like Barack Obama, and they could potentially see themselves voting for a Kamala Harris without any real reservations as well. For these conservative voters, they see the country as being in an increasingly good place, and they don't want to see that progress either obstructed or brought to a halt or reversed in the same way that it was for like Roe v. Wade and a number of other issues that have come out poorly through the Supreme Court for conservatives of, our general legal principles and precedents. We have had a very non-conservative bunch of conservatives in the Supreme Court, specifically just overturning settled law at this point. So the next time you hear a Republican politician refer to themselves as a conservative, I want to ask yourself, what are they conserving? What are they actually conserving? Because it seems they don't have many conservative ideas at all. With all that being said, thank you guys so much for watching this second take on conservatism, which was just largely a broad explanation of the social axis of politics. And I think the thing that people miss is they pick out an identity at some point in their life and assume that that is the political orientation that was when you picked it out is your political orientation for life. And no, that changes, especially on the social axis. Because if you only wanted, like, gay marriage, but you thought everything else was good, then you are now in a socially conservative position. You want to conserve that. You think everything else is working out pretty fine. So you're into this. You're into what we're doing right now politically. And that makes you a conservative. And in the future, given certain things, like, for me, it's probably like the encroachment of technology into our lives and how it's destabilized us. This could be a positive change, but it could also just be disruption. And this disruption could lead to this kind of fragile state that we call life and domination over the planet and actual control of our destiny. We could lose that. It's incredibly fragile. So this is something that's just changing things too fast in a way that I actually do feel conservative, if not even regressive, about. Like, I already think that with technology in many ways we've gone too far, and this is going to have serious impacts on younger generations who are growing up addicted to these highly addictive technologies that have been cultivated for such by the parent companies and apps that are developed by them. And again, like I said, people are politically nuanced. Even I have topics that I feel kind of regressive on, even though most of my social policy would be progressive, if not even, honestly, kind of utopian in some ways. Because I think that there are things that we should be working towards intergenerationally that are going to be hard to accomplish in just my lifetime. And I would hope that the forward progress of humankind continues after me. It doesn't just stop where I want it to stop. Even though at some point in the future, when most of my checklist of progressive goals has been achieved, I will feel more conservative than honestly progressive. I will probably fight harder to lock in the gains that we've had over time so I don't lose them, especially since we've seen one that I thought was like fundamentally taken for granted during my entire life, Roe versus Wade, settled law being overturned. That makes me feel more conservative about everything else. That instills the fear because, there was just, I don't necessarily say that I would have pride in our country because of our abortion law. Maybe what would instill more pride in me was like gay marriage laws. That's why I bring that up as a democratic, social, conservative issue so much. That's one that, we're seeing pushback on. And when we were just fighting for it, before we got it, we had no fear that it would be taken away. But as we got it and as people fought to remove it, we had both sides of that kind of conservative preconception. And people don't realize that antagonizing groups, especially groups that have recently gained certain rights, that are just now beginning to feel conservative about these issues, actually antagonizing them, that kind of fear that you're instilling in them, that prodding that you love to see Donald Trump do to the liberals so much, all of the talk about wokeness, all of that is further motivating these people to get out and vote against you because you are instilling in them the fear that is required to truly activate their conservatism. And as we know, conservative voters, for the most part, tend to, like actual conservative voters, which leans into our older voters pretty heavily, tend to vote more consistently than younger and more liberal voters. So you're really messing with a very consistently voting and older block of people when you're just trolling them like this with your presidential candidate. And I don't think that that's good policy. I think maybe it worked once in a special set of circumstances against a uniquely unpopular candidate, being Hillary Clinton, but I don't think it's going to be successful against, I think it could have won against Biden in that, it's hard to vote for someone who seems to be going through cognitive decline, but don't underestimate the fact that we could all see that he was going through cognitive decline, and still most of us would have rolled the dice on that and the uncertain outcome that was, instead of doing what we feared and not voting or even voting for Trump, which would be the ultimate fear that we would have. So, with all that being said, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe so that you get future takes like this. You can also check out the link in the description that's going to show you around the Jackie Fox Media universe, other channels. There's a podcast version of this channel, also a video version of this channel. I write books in fiction and in kind of like realistic modern fiction, but also kind of like fantasy or science fiction landscapes as well. I enjoy thinking about what a future could be like or could be different. And that's also why I enjoy making this content, trying to understand things differently and understand how the world could be seen differently, because I think it can free us up to make connections that we wouldn't ordinarily be able to. So if you appreciate that, let me know in the comments. Leave a comment on where you feel like you fall. If you feel like, given these two videos, that maybe the memes are right, maybe you are getting more conservative, not in necessarily the hostile, bigoted way that we see represented within politics, but like in the truer sense of, you know what, I'm actually feeling happier with the progress we've made during my lifetime, and I would like to keep it, instead of going backwards in time with another regressive president. With all that being said, I just want to say thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.